Now, development, those of us who are engaged with development in different ways, as consultants or activists or scholars, we all feel that the available method and mode of development is in a crisis. For example, in the last 20 years or 25 years, so people have felt an increasing irrelevance of the very concept of development, of the very process of development, as illustrated by the work of post-development scholars. For example, my respected friend Arturo Escobar has wrote a book more than 10 years ago, Encountering Development, the making and unmaking of the third world. So Escobar, as well as many people, drawing inspiration from critical deconstructive reflection, namely from Foucault and others, they have interrogated the very apparatus of development as mainly not development but as destruction. And no matter what side we take, there is a lot of truth and there is a lot of need for this foundational interrogation. On the other side, there is a shift, mainly in the last 15 years or so, from a state-led development into management as the archetypal, as the main method of development. So in fact, there is a uncritical shift from state to market in terms of market rationality and market as the agent for delivery of developmental goods. So the crisis of development today is, along with this, the crisis is also much deeper. What I would like to draw your attention to, that there is a fundamental crisis in terms of thinking about development and categories of development, and slowly we will try to understand some of them. So the first crisis is a crisis of disjunction between action and reflection. For example, if in the field of development and development as a field of action, there is an uncritical shift from state to market, okay, then in the critical reflection field, there is an uncritical shift from valorizing development, that development would be able to deliver us salvation, to a total abandonment of any agenda of development. So it is in this context that we are invited to think about action and reflection in their own multidimensionality. What I would like to present before you a series of concentric circles as a way of moving beyond the dualistic logic of development, okay? And in many ways, if we look at the whole project of development after Second World War, began as development as something to do good for the poor in the developing world, in the third world countries. So right from there was an other-oriented dimension built into development. Development is not for myself, okay? Development is for the other. And that, therefore, there is a dualism between development as mainly for the poor, helpless other, being delivered by agents of development who have more power, more money, and as you have known, that they take all decisions. And those of us who are students of development, we know that even the rise of the so-called participatory development, whether it is participatory rural appraisal, okay, and in fact, our good friend from SOAS, David Maas, has written an interesting paper in a volume that we have co-edited called A Moral Critique of Development, in which David Maas writes that how participation has become another word to deceive people. So you just change words. Earlier it was the same hegemonic logic of hierarchy decision making, and now you just, instead of that, you just write the word participation. So the point is that there is an inbuilt othering built into development project from the very genealogy of development, and today we are invited to go beyond development as not only for the poor third world people, development, who is the poor today? In fact, the very conception of poverty is deeply humiliating. Whom do you call poor? In fact, in my work on self-realization and global justice, I find, coming from Norway, for example, 2 months ago I was there, and I just chanced upon a meeting with sisters of missionaries of charity, and those who have been inspired by Mother Teresa. And I had a chance meeting with them, and they invited me to have a longer time. And the kind of narration she provided, that human deprivation, people not having anybody to speak with each other. And therefore, if we look at, on the one hand, the kind of statistics, global statistics that animate documents like Millennium Development Goals, okay, that even now, say around 40% of children of the world have difficulties in terms of proper nutrition. We know all these statistics, but the point is, those people who are suffering from a need of belonging, that is a form of self and social suffering. And those people who do not have any food to eat and dying out of starvation, this is also a form of self and social suffering. Therefore, we would have to transform all these, paternalistic and deeply humiliating terms like poverty and look at human condition in a much more non-dual way. For example, transform this notion of poverty into looking at each of us as implicated in self and social suffering, and then what is the challenge for human development. So just to prefigure that discussion, I would like to draw your attention to the seminal work of Amartya Sen, for example, when he says development as freedom. We know the UNDP and the Human Development Index, HDI, and the whole notion of development as freedom, when development means creating the capacities and functioning of individuals, and that development as freedom. In Amartya Sen, we know that book published in 1999, and also accompanied by the notion of democratic participation, development as democratic transformation. It is very important. But this idea of development as freedom, okay, now has to be transformed into development as responsibility. Because freedom, and it is an important category in Western modernity, and let us not forget that when we talk about global development, it has been a process of globalization of Euro-American conception of being human and being developed, mainly economic development and political empowerment. That too, political empowerment in a particular way. To be empowered politically, at one stage it involves certain confrontation, okay? But at another stage, that confrontation has to lead to building up certain foundation of solidarity, so that certain common social action is possible. Okay. So what has happened, that the Euro-American conception of economic development and political empowerment is a particular kind of economic development and political empowerment, and it has been globalized in the last 300 years of Western colonization and in the post-war period in the so-called development, missionary transmission. So what we are invited to is to think of development as responsibility. But just to give you a sense of how that other oriented logic still works, Okay, I'm not immediately finding it here, but just to put forward the argument, in this book, Development as Freedom, Amartya Sen writes that African Americans in the United States are relatively poor compared with American whites, though much richer than people in the third world. It is, however, important to recognize that African Americans have an absolutely lower chance of reaching mature ages than do people in many third world societies such as China or Sri Lanka or parts of India. If development analysis is relevant even for richer countries, the presence of such intergroup contrasts within richer countries can be seen to be an important aspect of understanding of development and underdevelopment. Okay? So you got the spirit of this sentence, this thought that in a country like the US, development thinking is relevant only to think about the whole situations of intergroup contrast. And to putting it in a visual metaphor, you know the problem of the Afro-American young girls getting pregnant at a young age and all the difficulties that goes along with it, the poverty, social deprivation. Then the question is that is development thinking relevant only for the unwed Afro-American girls? Okay, what about those people in the corridors of power who would like to change the world by dropping bombs everywhere? Is there any challenge for development there? So it is very crucial to go beyond this dualism of the self and the other, and to invite quite crucially that development as a multidimensional process of being, of hope, of politics, of application and administration, it simultaneously involves the self and the other in many ways. And one of the great poverty of development project and development thinking has been an abandonment of concern about self-development. So one of the challenges that I would like to put forward is to transform development into varieties of self-development, and here we can learn from different development movements around the world, including we would have to invite different civilizational, cultural dialogues about what it means to be human. So it is in this context that to understand development as global responsibility, we would have to understand first what do we mean by development. I would like to submit that development is a field. Okay? It is a field of action, field of reflection, field of being together, field of mutuality, okay, involving varieties of dimensions and processes. Let us, for example, try to understand how the field of development simultaneously consists of the dimension of hope, dimensions of application and administration, and dimensions of critical reflection. After the Second World War, okay, the rise of the human rights and development as an important agenda of international relations. So at that moment, development, global development, was animated by a sense of hope, never again. Okay? Now that hope had to be put into practice. Okay? And as you know, when you start loving, okay, everything looks very poetic, and then when you come together, then it has to inevitably find a lot of inescapable difficulties. Okay? And so therefore right from 50s and 60s, development application found many difficulties, like Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama chronicling, the work of development in a country like India, what kind of bureaucratic bottlenecks, corruption, and so on and so forth. Okay? And not to mention the perennial problem of the othering that I have mentioned, And as a result, what happens? There is a kind of mirroring going on even now in development, and it looks like this. Those people who give money and those who execute development projects, they think that without them the world would not exist. And my friend, Philip Quarles, with whom we have edited this work, he, like myself, he is a field working anthropologist. So from his work in Java, he find that the money that was given for the birth pills, for the birth control pills, okay, so they dumped a lot of birth control pills, and what happened? And all the villagers, they put the birth control pills in the fields, So, and the point is, on the one side, there is that arrogance that the world would not exist for a moment without development aid. On the other side, for the people, it is when these development agents come, we would always say, oh, without you, we cannot exist for a moment, okay? And after 1 minute, life is possible because of the creativity of the poor in many, not only, I should not use the word poor, creativity of the vulnerable in many difficult situations. And therefore, we would have to transform this kind of arrogant mirroring into really a reality check. And it is in that context that because of all this in the last 25 years, critical understanding that development is not development, development is destruction, we would have to go beyond development through the argument of the post-developmentalist thinkers is very important. But now, we would have to then reconstitute the field of development as simultaneously hope, simultaneously application and administration, and simultaneously involving critical reflection. Okay? And then there is another important historical and discursive shift that has taken place, we would have to understand. Now, if we look at the trajectory of Western development, especially in the spirit of democratization of human rights, okay, we begin with the discourse of rights, okay, and then in 19th century, on the wake of industrial revolution and the pathologies brought by industrial revolution and the poverty, deprivation, people had to talk about justice. And justice became, both rights and justice became an important frame in thinking about, say, politics. So some of these thoughts are described in these paragraphs, But what I wish to draw your attention to is that rights discourse and rights practice through political movements, okay, and then the justice discourse and justice movements, okay, and for the last 30, 40 years, especially with the explosion of the environmental problem and the rise of what people call as risk society, and that risk society had manifested in many ways, okay, both medical risk, environmental risk, risk of biotechnology, now risk of global terrorism. Okay? So the rise of risk society, it suggests the environmental problem cannot be solved only through the discourse of rights or justice. It requires a mode of responsibility. So this is the argument of my respected friend Pete Stridham at University College Cork, who has written a very fascinating book called Discourse and Knowledge, and another book called Risk, Environment and Society. So therefore, today we would have to think about development as simultaneously involving rights, simultaneously involving justice, and simultaneously involving responsibility. Okay? But once we come to responsibility, then a very important question is, who is the actor of responsibility? Because we know in the last 25 years, in the political discourse, especially in Britain, what has happened, that you blame the victims. You expect the victims to be responsible for their own conditions, On the other hand, the earlier welfare state thought, again in an arrogant manner, that all the problems could be solved only through state welfare action. And we have seen that that also does not work. So then we are invited to think about responsibility as simultaneously self-responsibility and collective responsibility. Collective responsibility meaning the institutions of state, society, educational institutions, civil society organizations. All of us, we are invited to embody responsibility in our own differentiated ways. There is no homogeneous project or program of responsibility. So then development as a field of responsibility consists of multiple actors and domains. Again, we are invited to go beyond a one-sided logic of either state or market. Earlier we had state-led development or interstate, big interstate organizations, even the World Bank, what World Bank is. It is primarily an interstate big organization, and now it is really the messiah of the development in terms of more and more market principles. So, but our state and market are the only actors in development. We know that they are not. Social movement is a very important actor. Social movement, voluntary organizations, civil society organizations, drawing from many resources, secular, religious, and varieties of resources. So this is an important actor in the field of development, and also self. Now we would also have to invite self as an important actor in the field of development, and this self exists in all domains, isn't it? There is an interesting story. Can I tell you this? And that is the story in Indian folktale that once there was a crocodile, okay, and there was a monkey, okay, and they became very good friends. In fact, it would be a very interesting metaphor to think about development relations. Very good friends. Then the crocodile, in this friendship, could have his cognitive sense that the liver of the jackal would be quite tasty. Okay, and then one day the crocodile said, "Okay, my dear friend, you have been always on the top of the trees. Why don't you come? I will show you some beautiful pearls and waves and landscape in the middle of the river." And the monkey jumped into and then in the middle of the river, the crocodile said, "Okay, but I asked you not to so much make you aesthetic, to appreciate the setting sun here, but I thought you have a tasty liver." Okay, and then the monkey said, "Oh yes, I also agree with you, but I have left my liver in the top of the tree." Now, I invite you to think about this. If you look at the whole discourse of self, it's a bit like this. In all these domains, even now, okay, self is like a lever we think that we have left on the top of the tree when we are implicated in the state action or the movemental action. So therefore, it is this, to understand development, first of all, the field of development, and then I would now elaborate what are the challenges of responsibility. We are invited to realize, conceptualize, and be related to development in a multidimensional way, embody a logic of multi-valued logic, okay, going beyond the dualistic logic of any kind, whether the state versus the market, or self versus the market, or self versus the state. The other thing is that once we have such a multi-valued logic of understanding and embodiment of responsibility, we find that all these categories, they are not static. For example, in a particular social field, what is the nature of state would be dependent upon the nature of social movements. For example, I hear a lot of difficulty in the health field in Ireland. Okay, we have a colleague here from the health promotion field, But my sociologist friend in Cork, they tell me that how there are also different kind of peasant movements, a little bit of civil society mobilizations, and maybe we will have a little bit of implication of it in the election to come. But the point is that the state itself, everywhere, its quality depends upon the quality of civic action. And even in the most difficult circumstances, whether it is in China or in tribal India, where state can be, is very violent. So the nature of social movement transforms the logic of state. Similarly, if you have a vigilant self, okay, then this vigilant self or a community of self can really transform NGOs. You told me during our discussion that how NGOs are not, the best thing, in the world to think about development. But once in the field of NGOs, there are critical selves or community of self, it would transform the nature of NGO action. And it is also happening if we look at international development. For example, Professor Arjun Appadurai has a very interesting paper called Culture and the Capacity to Aspire, in which he is saying that when slum development organizations working in Karachi, they visit people in Bombay, what happens, because these people are not from Bombay, from the local area, they can always ask, okay, you told us that you have really built so much, but on the ground we do not see this. So the point is that there is a lot of mutual learning, mutual critical learning. Okay, so then we come to development as global responsibility, and I would just like to quickly mention, and we can pick up in details later in the discussion. Again, responsibility, what does it mean? It has a socio-political dimension, okay, where the state and collective agencies are much more implicated. It has an ethico-moral dimension, okay, in terms of responsibility, as philosopher Levinas has spoken, that responsibility means to be able to look up to the face of the other. Okay? And also Gandhi would say that what does it mean that for him that any action that we do, whether it is moral or immoral, depends upon whether that action, that thought would be able to bring Swaraj. Swaraj means autonomy, okay, to the most helpless person in that situation. It is also a vision of responsibility in an ethico-moral way. Of course, in Gandhi, socio-political, ethico-moral and spiritual, they all came together. Another thing about responsibility is that responsibility is not just in the public sphere. In contemporary political and development discussion, the notion of the public sphere has been an important concern. Jürgen Habermas, and in fact in terms of democracy, one important goal has been how do we create more and more public sphere where people can come together and discuss their ways in an unhindered way. But responsibility does not arise only out of public sphere. Responsibility also involves appropriate self-cultivation. With this then, I would like to quickly come to three important aspects of development as global responsibility. Okay, one is that development as global responsibility means to think about development in a multidimensional way beyond Eurocentric imprisonment, and therefore it invites us for broadening and deepening the meaning and practice of development, which thus involves transcultural dialogues, trans-civilizational dialogues. So one component of development as global responsibility is being part of trans-civilizational, transcultural dialogues on the vision and practice of development. The second aspect is an aspect of justice. Development as global responsibility means striving for global justice at the contemporary juncture in the context of neoliberal corporatization of the world and rising, growing inequality. And this growing inequality is not just innocent. When people die on the way to the hospital, and when a country has 300,000 millionaires, okay, then this inequality is not just innocent inequality. So this inequality is a life, destroying inequality. And not to mention what is happening today everywhere, that this growing social inequality is really leading to the destruction of public systems, whether we call public health or public education. Now in India, if in a local community, because of rising wealth of some people, and they can afford good schools, where to enter inside schools you have to pay, say, 15,000 rupees, then those people who do not have money, they are destined to come to the public schools, and in the public schools, the cows and the crows, they are writing their poetry of life, So then the second aspect, the aspect of global justice, especially in the context of the contemporary rising inequality. And the third aspect is what I call as new realization of responsibility in terms of peace development and a practice of co-suffering. So we will move one by one, as I have already noted that one fundamental challenge in a trans-civilizational dialogue is to acknowledge that development means also self-development. Okay? One important movement which has been putting this into practice is a movement called Swadhyaya in contemporary India, which means study of self. Swadhyaya has been working for the last 50 years, but in the last 30-35 years, it has taken a social turn. It has many activities which brings interested people together. For example, in a village, people would come together, take a piece of land, okay, and then do agriculture together on the basis of what is called as Srama Bhakti or devotional labor. So what happens in Swadhyaya, there is not money from the government, there is not money from World Bank. People come together and work together. So this sharing of time and labor thus becomes a source of value. And therefore, its implication for transforming developmental practice and thinking is to go beyond the logic of money and market and to discover the strength within ourselves, And it has important implications for any kind of development practice, If you look at that, much of the space in the world today is being incorporated. If we have a seminar, we are going to, where do we go? We would have to rent a place, and so in the context of this incorporatization of the world, marketization of the world, discovering our own ability to generate value through the act of being together in time and labor is an important invitation for a trans-civilizational realization, including realizing the potential and possibilities, self-potential and collective possibility in each of us. What Swadhyaya does, there is an interesting learning involved. I remember my time with one of the Swadhyaya activities. They have a project called Sri Darshanam, okay, which brings people from 20 villages together. Okay. And one morning, myself, taking the weeds in this field, and simultaneously on the one side is a businessman and another side is an agriculturist. And this agriculturist told me that the significance of being together in an activity like this, that he can also learn a little bit about business, So therefore, this kind of occasion provides an occasion for mutual learning, collective learning. And also I have, in my work, I have found tribal development in remote tribal districts facilitated by the kind of learning that has taken place when farmers visit tribal villages and discuss the possibilities of new kind of agriculture. Now, this kind of activity can be immediately read through the language of social capital, isn't it? You are all familiar with that. And but what it is not just social capital. where trust is instrumentally used for generation of social prosperity. What happens in Swadhyaya, that the very being together is an activity in itself, okay? And then what happens, social development is a byproduct of that, okay? So therefore, the contemporary logic of social capital has still a very instrumental notion of both trust and social capital, and not to mention that it really does not have a spiritual dimension of mobilization of social capital. Another thing is that all these products in Swadhyaya are looked at as impersonal wealth, not being possessed by anybody. So Swadhyaya invites us to embody a new way of relating to wealth, okay? And nobody is talking about that, because we knew that with the decline of Marxism and collapse of state socialism, then therefore the whole issue of private property and the destruction that private property brings to human life, there is no critical discussion about it. But the point is, here we are invited, it is not a question of collectivization or total privatization. A much more fundamental challenge is to develop a new relationship of wealth, okay? And that relationship could have transformative potential. And if you look at, say, cutting edge technology like software and, the mode of production there, as Hart and Negri write in their latest book, Multitude, that much of this production is a very cooperative production, if you are looking, and therefore the notion of private property is not very helpful there, in fact it is an obstruction. So therefore, along with that, discovering new modes of cooperative basis of human organizations, but ontologically, or in the level of self, we would have to learn to develop a non-possessive approach to wealth as to knowledge. And therefore, knowledge becomes a contribution to common ground, rather than knowledge is just a source of power or source of profit in terms of copyright. The second aspect of justice is, we know that there is the problem of rising inequality, as I have already mentioned. But there are also some small movements to bring the issue of justice. If we look at a movement like Attac in Europe, which talks about tax justice, but this whole tax justice is just an entry point to talk about that what is the implication of neoliberal economic restructuring in Scandinavia, in Sweden, Denmark. In the tradition of popular education for the last 100 years, the work of Attac also has taken a character of a popular education, having seminars, popular discussions, to educate people about the working of the global economy. And that kind of spirit you would also find in the World Social Forums, That World Social Forum is an important civil society space. And this World Social Forum is now happening in many places, not only in Bombay as it happened, or in Porto Alegre, or in Africa. It is happening in Lund, Sweden. It is happening in Hyderabad, India. So this whole movement of World Social Forum and varieties of local social forum, whether it is British Social Forum or European Social Forum, it is again an important aspect embodying a concern for global justice and global responsibility in an interesting way. So therefore, global civil society, and another thing that is happening, that in many parts of the world, especially in the field of mining, if you look at China or India, that most of the vulnerable communities are today, their life is being destroyed through multinational mining. And I come from Orissa, and the people in one of the very difficult tribal communities for the last 15, 20 years, they have been waging a very difficult struggle against multinational companies, bauxite mining, where state has become a helpless servant of multinational capital, to the extent that to a peaceful assembly of people, when people, tribal people, were running to the hills just to save their life, comes the police force and shoots them. So this is also the logic if the war in Afghanistan and Iraq is the visible part of the global violence, okay, and the invisible part of the contemporary violence is also in spaces like this. But people are fighting, people are struggling. But what happens when tribal people are giving their life? Here, the tribal people, what we would have to invite another aspect of our contemporary world, that is, while 6%, maybe 5-6% of the total world population are tribals or indigenous people, nearly 40% of world resources are in these areas. Okay? So therefore, it is a very difficult situation unless we transform the logic of production and consumption and come to a basis of certain respectful dignity at the societal level, at the planetary level. Then, and if the state and civil society abdicates its responsibility, then this blood and tear are destiny. But when the tribal people are struggling, it is not just struggling for their own homeland. It is a struggle on behalf of humanity for a new mode of production, for a new mode of consumption. Because as we know, that contemporary mode of production and consumption is not really sustainable. So therefore, to conclude, so I would like to conclude with the issue of peace and peace and development. But before that, let us not forget one concern about justice. That is that we are familiar with the work of John Rawls, isn't it? A Theory of Justice. Now, when we talk of justice, global justice, both theoretically and practically, now is justice is only political, as Rawls had spoken. He had a dictum, justice political, not metaphysical. And many years after, Jürgen Habermas, the celebrated critical theorist of Europe, he writes that today the global problems of the world, including economic inequality, belongs to the cupboard of politics and not to morality. But if we look at contemporary global justice movement, whether it is Jubilee 2000 or many kind of action groups in the international field, they come from different sources. And most of them come from some religious sources, some spiritual sources. Therefore, even practically, this dualism between justice as political and justice as metaphysical is not helpful. But theoretically, so we are challenged to go beyond this self-confident political conception of justice to justice simultaneously political, ethico-moral and spiritual. Then the other aspect of justice is, it is not just confined within nation state. If we would have to go to global justice, then in fact the act of justice today is embodied through people who relate to each other in a person-to-person manner. Amartya Sen has a very interesting paper called Justice Across Borders, in which he writes that a woman activist in North America who identifies herself with a vulnerable woman in Bangladesh, what kind of justice is at work here? It is an act of person-to-person solidarity going beyond the logic of nation state. If I had time, we could have elaborated much more, but the point is made, well, already made. This third aspect is that if justice involves, as Rawls would say, a work of overlapping consensus, okay? This is again another very familiar term with Rawlsian conception of justice. Then this overlapping consensus, is it a gift from the sky? Or, are we going to just get it, singing the glory of the nation state? Or this overlapping consensus is a work together in which, in order that we can realize a state of overlapping consensus, all the involved parties, they would have to transcend their own egocentricity, their own group centricity, and then come to certain, point of contact. So therefore, the work of overlapping consensus involves a work of transcendence. But theoretically, that is not talked about in discourse of justice. Martha Nussbaum has an interesting book called Frontiers of Justice, in which she discusses some of these, but she really does not go beyond this Rawlsian founding. But Nussbaum does point to a very important aspect, what he calls as justice for non-human animals. Okay? And what I would like to say then, that justice, global justice today involves also to think about justice for non-human animals, what Martha Nussbaum calls as cross-species dignity. But it invites us to go beyond anthropocentrism. In the field of human development, people have spoken about anthropocentrism with a human face. Okay? But this is okay to begin with, but now we need much more radical rethinking about of our place in the world. You know, certainly we are a co-being in the species being in the world, rather than we are just masters. Therefore, we embody a spirit of responsible guardianship. So to conclude, I would like to submit that today development as global responsibility invites us to embody responsibility in many ways. First of all, thinking that we are not just masters of the world or mistresses of the world. Okay? We are embodiment of responsibility in a spirit of quote unquote we are servants of the world. And you know, and this requires a profound rethinking, especially in the context of modern cult of sovereignty and ideology of possessive individualism. In fact, it is John Ruskin, in a book called Art and Life, nearly 150 years ago, he has made this small sentence. Now, for a moment, can you imagine how the world would look like if each of us, we consider ourselves as being servants to each other? You know? And it's a different kind of relationships. You know, it embodies a logic of what I call a shared sovereignty rather than absolute sovereignty. And another aspect is the notion of terrorism. And today, it is not just an accident that the person who is battling for his post today in World Bank, you know about him. So he was one of the main engineers of the war in Iraq, you know. And is it just accident that somebody, you know, who was a great protagonist of war, then he is, you know, put into the World Bank, you know? It is not just accident. The point is today there is an instrumental, you know, reconfiguration of development, that let us have development so that we can avoid the sources of terrorism. But the point is that today we are really invited to go beyond this logic of terror, both the logic of terror from one side, but also logic of state terror and the international terror, and really understand the crucial significance between peace and development. Okay? And what does it mean? And I would just like to conclude with this statement from Erasmus. Because today, everybody, you know, would like to kill everybody else, you know, and peace is a crying, you know, she's a crying, you know, mother, let us put it like that. Peace is a crying mother. But what is the complaints of peace that Erasmus had written? This inspiring person from Europe had written nearly 500-600 years ago in the context of war against the Turks, and in which Erasmus is saying that peace is saying, her complaint is not so much that you are not obeying me, that I feel miserable, that the kind of misery that you are bringing onto yourself. And so therefore development as responsibility, development as global responsibility involves multidimensional work with peace. Okay? Peace in one's own heart, okay? And it involves therefore a different kind of being developed, you know. And if we spend say all the time in earning money, okay, and if we have a railway system, okay, where if you miss your train, suppose you have purchased a ticket for 7 o'clock, okay, if you just got late, you know, because you wanted to bring a flower for your love, and then you are anxious that you would miss the train and then you cannot travel, you would have to buy another train. So the point, if you look at that, the contemporary organization of living, more and more in places like Britain and, you know, and everybody is learning from them, is producing anxiety, okay? A deep anxiety which is structurally produced through the very logic of social organization. So how can there be peace in one's own heart? So peace, therefore, peace is related to production of non-anxiety, and that has dimension in self, intersubjective relations, the logic of economy, the logic of workplace, logic of polity. Therefore, development is part of a project of self-development, inclusion of the other, many other. And now today in a country like Ireland, it is, you know, challenged to be much more multicultural. Then what is the logic of inclusion, you know? It is a new experience, so one has to go through that, and inclusion of the other in varieties of ways, and then through that also not to forget the calling of planetary realizations, that we are not only citizens of the world, because there is no world government, but my problem is not just that we cannot have world government, that the whole notion of citizenship is helpful but limiting. Let us think of ourselves as simultaneously children of Mother Earth. Thank you.